So Yasha is the founder, concept creator, and executive director of Urban Nation, the worldwide first museum for urban contemporary art in Berlin. And you stopped working there in 2019, I think. Partner and co-founder for the 4M, which is the Museum for Contemporary Culture in New York City. And Yasha's joining us now from New York. Happily, she likes the mornings, so that's okay because it's pretty early there. She's Senior Executive and Curator with 25 years international project production experience, including the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, MOMA Italy, United Nations, Foreign Ministry Germany. There's a long list. It'll take me longer to read it out than for Yasha's presentation, so I'm stopping there. But you can see that her experience is very extensive in different countries and really a lot of unusual kinds of cultural organization. She's known as an international speaker, and she's now studying at Harvard about new trends and concepts for cultural institutions.
All right, well, thank you so very much, A, for inviting me. Welcome everyone who's here, and B, for making me feel like I've achieved something in life. And I'm very humble, but thank you so much for summarizing my work so beautifully. I was listening to when you started the conversation, and it's funny because when I go into telling you a little bit about my story, it has a lot to do with what you mentioned, and that just goes to show how important these issues are and how many people are simultaneously thinking of it. I would like to do this a little bit like a story. I came back to my home in Brooklyn, New York to build a new museum, and that was last November. I was researching in Harvard for my thesis. I was writing about new innovative museum structures and exhibition planning for the 21st century museum, about the digital changes institutions had made or did not make since 2010. And I also joined the ongoing discussion about ICOM. ICOM, that is the International Council of Museums. And I joined the discussion about their efforts to come up with a new definition of what the museum of the future should be. So I know it's a lot of theory, but let's just talk about the definition for a second. And then as we move forward, keep in mind this exhibition, this definition if you can. So the old definition of what a museum is and should be was: a museum is a nonprofit, permanent institution in the service of society and its development. It is open to public, which acquires, conserves, research, communicate, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity, its environment, for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment. That already is a mouthful. So now let's go to the proposed new definition. Museums are democratizing, inclusive, and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about the past and the future, acknowledging and addressing the conflict and challenges of the present. They hold artifacts and specimens in trust for society. They safeguard diverse memories for future generations and guarantee equal rights and equal access to heritage for all people. Museums are not for profit. They are participatory and transparent and work in active partnership with and for diverse communities to collect, preserve, research, interpret, exhibit, and enhance understandings of the world, aiming to contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. So all of this is supposed to be done by a museum. And by the way, later on realized that joy in education went right out of the window in this new definition. So of course, this suggestion was vehemently rejected by the council and still is not final years later, and is the cause for a deep rupture in the museum community. Feel also free to ask me about this later. Full stop, March 2020 came, and then with it came COVID-19. My production of the museum came to an abrupt halt immediately. Stock market has tanked, Harvard's closed its door and went virtual, and there simply was no such thing as going back to normal or a new normal. There was just now. And the news and daily reports of death and new measures of human tragedy, as we were trying to save ourselves from an invisible, unknown, resilient, and smart and ever-changing attacker. So exactly at that moment in time, when the virus was at its height and I was in New York, David asked me to participate in a webinar, and he asked me to wrap my head around questions he sent me. And for me, one of the first questions was the most crucial one. How do we now identify the essence of our work? Well, what is the first thing you need to know when it comes to your essence? What you are made of? Your DNA. Though the term company DNA is used to describe an organization's cultural and culture and strategy, it's a metaphor for what makes it unique. And understanding your institution's DNA can help you know what you can, but more importantly, what you cannot do, and how to achieve agility, how to remain relevant and authentic in this interrupted world. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, basically what this new situation with COVID has created, and David just said it, was not only a huge urgency, and a new urgency for all topics, but it was forcing us to pick up speed and act, innovate and create our new identities ASAP. The main question was no longer what are museums, but what are we now, like right now, in the immediate now, and all the new realities we are dealing with. Museums closures would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. The American Association of Museums predicts that 1/3 of all museums will close doors for good. Staff layoffs are final. Only 50% of all staff may return, and in some cases even less. Funding is pulled. State funding here wildly not available. The sale of artwork out of museums' collections to private people to fund your operations, your day-to-day operations, and your staff was prohibited and severely frowned upon. But it is now a necessary means to survival. And by being forced to close our doors, and this is probably the most important thing, we were deprived of what kept us alive, our main stakeholders, those that matter most and whom we serve, the public. Well, now what? If we can't serve our audience and we can't create the experiences we want to provide, what are we and why are we here? And dare I ask it, are we still relevant? So at first, museums, community, and institutions were incredibly hesitant with transferring to online, because who would then go back to those big expensive spaces and architectural marvels and buildings if everything would go online? And if we digitalize collections and experience, what about the in-person experience? And again, most importantly, who are these new audience that we connect with now online? It's almost like online dating, and you can't go Tinder because they're all here and they all have something to say. Well, indeed, we have to focus on additional audiences we might not have taken into consideration as a majority before the virus. People who are bored, adrift, in search of self-enrichment, people who are lonely and are probably in massive existential crisis, people who are feeling inadequate as educators for their kids, people who need relief from anxiety and trauma, people who experience grief from the loss of normalcy or the loss of a loved one. And then there was the question about workspace. Now we have these new audiences, and where would we meet them? New spaces of interactions. We all agree online is not enough, but we didn't know how long we were going to be closed, and where would we reopen? So working outside the institution and those halls of fame and glamour, or just these big spaces, after spending decades arguing that the outdoor space is second best for any institution, seemed hypocritical. Outreach programs were severely frowned upon. And yet now, the public space was the only space for the institution to connect with the public and to survive. And as a side note, the genre I work in, street art, was actually one of the main reasons who set an example. The only art that could continue to function outside, leave a social commentary, spread hope, connect people on an unprecedented level was street art. The work that my creative community has done with art in the streets during COVID is unbelievable. Additionally, during the riots across the country in the wake of George Floyd's atrocious and unnecessary death, it was urban contemporary art who helped spread the word, lift the spirit and the morale, and also demanded justice. So in fact, when we really think of everything now, 6+ months into it all, does it not become clear that we are facing a trifecta pandemic? COVID-19, a moral debate, and a global financial crisis. And really, we as museums, where are we relevant in all of this? And how do we deal with the new circumstances? So to me, turning towards each other, acting outward in the face of unprecedented challenges, instead of the more human common path of turning inward, trying to preserve what is there, what I know, in a desperate attempt to hold on, doesn't work. Outward is the only way to deal with the fundamental and existential questions for all institutions serving the public moving forward. Over the last decades, we discussed inclusion and participation and cross-genre collaboration. But the institutions that I worked with, institutions that were not that, in the beginning, the big institutions, they shied away from opening up too much. They didn't want to share space and knowledge. But the institutions I had the pleasure to work with, to restructure, reform, and digitalize, and those that had already began reshaping the DNA of their teams with new new digital options and experience way before COVID-19, had now unknowingly prepared the soil from which a much needed and expected change could grow. Museums that had added the virtual layer to their exhibitions or institutions' online presence, for example, had much less costly and faster ways to remain seen and heard and offer support during the lockdown and temporary closures. So you may not know this, or you may, I don't know, but for us, the new hashtags and crowd and community funded campaigns, unheard of before, dominated the virtual space in the first month of COVID. The flexibility of institutions that had already focused their work to incorporate social media aspects proved that exactly that approach provided the resilience needed to navigate the struggles ahead. Hashtag campaigns and challenges like Museum from Home, Museum Moment of Zen, the Getty Museum Challenge acted as catalysts and umbrellas for institutions to bond and also to realize, hey, my followers, my audience are now my followers, and these followers or friends or audience, they become our innovators. They're their micro curators, opinion leaders, and they help us ultimately to understand who we were now to them and what would be expected from us through comments, et cetera, and through participation. And the institutions listened and acted, and all that without an ICOM definition in place. We are collaborating and exchanging programs and sharing and transferring knowledge for free, and most of all, publicly. We have generated access and knowledge and education for everyone, if you had internet, by the way, a whole other topic. Participation across the board and for all generations, a community within the field, free learning and beyond. We started supporting healthcare issues. We partnered with local organizations. We offered our spaces up for food kitchens and established mental health and trauma support groups with art therapists. And we wanted to be vital participants of the future. So the pre-COVID-19 ongoing and mostly actionless debate on what we are and who we should be and all that drama about searching a new definition had suddenly found an unexpected, unfortunate, and unprecedented ally, a pandemic. The new interim, the new normal, as we sentimentally call it, with all its inventions and ideas set in as a quick fix and a Band-Aid. So we baked and then we tie-dyed and we danced and we zoomed the living hell out of each other. But let's look at these temporary patches and their long-term effects. Can the digital and virtual Band-Aids we have developed simply be ripped off and the wounds will heal? Or must we indeed think of this time in history as a holistic transformation, as a detox process for our particular industry and humanity, and as the world keeps looking for a cure or a vaccine for the virus, and yet even if there should be such a cure, human behavior may remain changed forever. Reluctant visitors may not return to participate in large-scale events. Donors will rethink their commitments in the face of ongoing financial crises. Museums will close, and artwork and pieces of memory will be lost forever. Education will be a struggle. And yet, I think we have to look at all of this as an accelerator for transformation. There are amazing possibilities and opportunities for actual change and progress if we are tough on ourselves. if we let go of all the past, all we have, like we're holding on to, and get in sync with the change, must we not be able to create something brilliant, something evolved, so we can actually be cultural guardians of the future, which is what we claim to be? So with an open heart and open eyes, I started thinking of options for change. What new incentives may be developed and offered to donors in collaboration with state tax officials, tax laws? How can and must we reform our educational program to be inclusive also for haptic learner? Not everybody loves the internet or can handle Zoom learning. What if large state-owned and funded institutions had to give 1% of their annual funding to a grassroots institution, and every year a different one? What if we implemented jobs such as online community managers, trauma and empathy experts, childcare specialists, outreach officers, dual language educators, immigration and family law lawyers, career advisors as a mandatory permanent staff in a museum? We can discuss how we pay for them. What if additionally, if it was mandatory for university and other degree programs to work with their local institutions on developing a co-learning program? Can we remember and go back to our roots and turn away of what we have too often seemed to become, an untouchable temple of elite knowledge reserved to only a few? But instead, why don't we just go back and serve as an extension of our community? Again, against common practice, I do not want to end on a high note for today, as I think we all should be really worried and ask uncomfortable questions to understand and feel the urgency, grow motivation and empathy, and act now. Questions like this one. And what if all of it was futile and we failed in rescuing the creative industry? What would a world without museums or art institutions look and feel like? How does humanity exist without content, visible, tangible, touchable, sensible, without our collective memory that we can experience in person, that will tell our story and the story of the world, past, present, and future? And the conclusion to me must be, we can't, we don't, and I will do my part that we certainly won't. Thank you very much.